And also, I feel that deeper thinking, maybe sometimes comes when we are bored, just because to address the same issue where the students are forced to wait. How do we connect these two things in real space in the classroom? Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Visible Studio, a space where educators, artists, designers, and creative thinkers come together to explore learning, identity, process, pedagogy, and practice. Today's guest speaker is Suzanne Rodgers, an art and design education consultant, curriculum specialist, and founder of SR Creative Curriculum Consultancy. All the details will be shared in the presentation, after the presentation in the link below. Suzanne has over 27 years of experience leading and shaping art and design education across schools in the UK and internationally. Her work focuses on curriculum architecture, process-led pedagogy, and research-informed practice, with a particular emphasis on designing thinking, independence, and sustained creative inquiry through curriculum rather than simply delivering content. So, over to you, Miss Suzanne, and yes.
Thank you, Debjani. Thank you very much for inviting me on this, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation today. So, on that note, I'm going to share my screen. And today, as Debjani said, I'm going to be talking to you about designing thinking in art and design and curriculum as a strategic driver of learning. So one of the things that I have become increasingly interested in over the years, through my classroom practice initially, through my curriculum leadership, my consultancy work, and my research, is the idea that curriculum is not neutral. Curriculum fundamentally shapes what they believe that creativity is, and it shapes whether they can experience art and design as somewhere they can genuinely think independently, or whether it's somewhere that they're mainly trying to get things right. And increasingly, I think curriculum architecture is really about the deliberate construction of artistic thinking over time. Strong outcomes in art rarely happen accidentally. They're usually the result of carefully structured experiences that gradually build independence, that gradually build refinement and sustained inquiry over time. And progression in art and design is cognitive rather than simply technical. It's about students developing more sophisticated ways of observing and questioning, and also refining and making artistic decisions independently. In my opinion, strong curriculum architecture rests on several interconnected ideas, and this is what I call the 5 structural pillars of a strong art and design curriculum, which you can see in the graphic on the screen here. And the first of those pillars is progression as agency. And what I mean by that is students gradually learning to direct, sustain, and refine ideas more independently over time. The second pillar is artists as thinking tools. And what I mean by that is artists functioning as frameworks for thought rather than simply templates for imitation. I'm also very interested in cultural capital through structure, where meaning and understanding are built cumulatively through repeated encounters rather than added superficially. Then materials. Now, materials matter enormously within this. In many ways, I feel that this is what sits at the heart of how I think about art and design education. I don't see materials simply as vehicles for outcomes. Students learn to think through
the
making.
materials. Oh my God, yes, that's exactly what I use in classrooms. So many.
And it's wonderful when you reframe it in that way, isn't it? Where they're thinking through making.
And sometimes, I'm sorry, I'm just like having a conversation that way. But I sometimes see my students coming and telling me, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to think. I don't know where to start. I said, okay, let's not get that cognitive heavy. Just hold some clay. And then let the material guide you through the process of making. And slowly in that process, something sparks, And
that's right.
And an observer, I can see the change in the student's face.
Yeah. So, it just changes their whole attitude to the subject, the way of working. And it's something I'm going to come to a little bit later in my presentation. Because, I think materials, they shape attention, they shape decision-making, experimentation, inquiry. And the way students engage with any materials, we've used clay here as an example, but it could be paper, it could be photography, wire, ink, whatever materials. The way they engage with those materials, it changes the kinds of questions that they ask and the kinds of discoveries that they make. But it's paying attention to that and noticing. And I think that thinking often happens through and with the materials as opposed to before the materials. And I also think here, just going back to the 5 structures, that assessment itself should also reveal the development of thinking rather than simply the production of evidence. So really thinking about how assessment can be built in and how we work with assessment. And once the curriculum starts focusing on what the students become capable of directing independently, the structure of learning, it changes quite significantly. So I think this becomes particularly important at, this says Key Stage 3. I'm aware that this presentation is going to be for an international audience. So what I'm talking about here is lower secondary years, ages 11 to 14, because this is often where students form their relationship with the subject. Yes. And many lower secondary curricular, Key Stage 3 curricular, contain lots of exciting projects and activities. But sometimes the breadth can often unintentionally create fragmentation. So I think this is something that really needs to be very well considered and structured, should I say, because students, you often see in lower secondary and those kind of formative years, that students move perhaps from drawing project to painting project to ceramics, where they're trying out lots of different materials, but often those conceptual threads underneath those experiences don't deepen over time, or don't deepen clearly over time. So increasingly, I think that progression shouldn't necessarily mean just doing more things. It should mean students developing a more sophisticated way or more sophisticated ways of observing, of questioning, of refining, connecting and directing ideas independently. So we're thinking here about, how we're building independence over time. One of the biggest shifts I often discuss with departments when I'm working with departments is moving from a task-driven curriculum towards really thinking-led structures. And in weaker models, students can become very focused on completing tasks correctly or producing outcomes that appear successful. But in stronger curriculum models, those students begin understanding that the real work lies in the decisions that they make throughout the process. So for instance, which materials to select, which ideas to pursue, what to refine, what to abandon, what to revisit, develop further. And I think that changes the nature of learning quite significantly, really, because I'm sure you'll agree with me here that independence, it can't suddenly appear at GCSE or at IB level, A level. That independence needs to grow through those formative years, and it has to be deliberately constructed through curriculum structure over time, through repeated opportunities for those students to direct, sustain, and refine ideas more independently. So a lot of my thinking came from and became very clear to me during my MA research at UCL, where I explored a material-led Year 9 project, which I called very simply To Play. And the project deliberately moved away from tightly led outcome structures, and instead it explored what happened when students engaged in much more open-ended material processes. And I used paper, you could use anything, but I used paper as the central pedagogical material. So students folded, twisted, suspended, layered, manipulated paper through exploratory processes, inspired partly by Richard Serra's Verbalist. And what fascinated me, it wasn't simply the outcomes, it was the shift in how students were thinking through their interaction with materials, like we were talking about earlier. And one student actually said to me at the beginning of this, I don't like that I don't know what I'm doing. And I found this incredibly revealing because it exposed how strongly that many students associate success with certainty
and product,
with correctness,
yes,
and predefined outcomes. You know, because they often naturally like to go into a project, a scheme of work, already having thought, okay, well, this is what I plan to do. This is how I plan my outcome to look. And that trying to sit with that uncertainty made them feel quite uncomfortable. However, gradually, through this process and through material exploration, something did begin to change. And the students, they started discovering that ideas could emerge through making rather than this need to be fully formed beforehand. And these students became more willing to test, to adapt, to revisit, and to sit with that uncertainty for longer. Now, it varied from student to student, but you could really see that shift in mindset.
And also to be open to surprises. You know, sometimes they are so blocked, even if something fantastic comes out of the mistakes that they call that, they're not, ready to take that and adapt their work to it.
That's right, and to embrace the things that happen by chance. Yes. And I think that's so important in the learning journey. And for me, I think thinking often happens, as I said, through and with materials. But this work, it became so important in shaping how I now think more about curriculum and artistic development more broadly. But this also, it significantly changed how I think about artist references and how I think about artist references within the curriculum. And this has actually become as well a major strand of the curriculum and CPD work that I now do with teacher groups and schools more broadly. And increasingly, I'm interested in the difference between artists functioning as templates for imitation and artists functioning as frameworks for thinking. So, just to put that into context, in less successful curriculum models, artist references can sometimes become quite performative, where students reproduce visual characteristics or stylistic features without necessarily deepening inquiry or developing ideas more independently. And when this is the case, we can often see that we're losing students. We're losing a lot of the students very, very early on because they feel they're not capable. Art's not a place for me. I don't belong here because I can't replicate this artist's work.
And they choose right in the beginning Leonardo da Vinci or Van Gogh up there, and they kind of decide very early. And they don't take into account the years of work that they have been doing.
And they don't see the processes that they have gone through. Yes. All they ever see is the outcome, the final outcome. They don't see the struggles they went through, the tensions. So what I've been working towards and what I'm seeing in stronger curriculum models is that artists actually become ways of extending thinking. So artists being introduced later in projects. And artists being used to introduce, say, different methodologies, conceptual structures, compositional approaches, material processes, and also ways of developing meaning. So the artist is no longer something students respond to visually. Artists actually become a way of helping students to think differently. I think that's the best way to put it.
Yes, you've just put that in words. Because often we start with that same structure of criteria A, doing the artist research, then the material, exactly trying to copy that. And by the time they reach their criteria D, the reflection, which I don't know why we do it at the end, then that entire energy and that thing has been drained away, or they're filled with lack of confidence.
And they've lost that independence as well. So in my work with teachers, we look at turning that on its head, start with making, and then introduce artists to help.
As and when required, and the kind of artists,
Yeah. So as I said, artists functioning less as models for imitation and more as frameworks for thought and for artistic decision making. So one of the things that naturally follows from this is how the thinking process then becomes visible within the learning process itself. And that's one of the reasons that I'm so interested in sketchbooks. And when I say sketchbooks, I don't necessarily mean your rectangular sketchbooks. I'm talking about sketchbooks in any form, whether they're digital, handmade, made up of lots of different sizes of paper, whatever, whether an installation space becomes a sketchbook in itself. So when I refer to sketchbooks, I'm thinking sketchbooks in the more broader sense. So one of the reasons that I'm so interested in sketchbooks and refinement within art and design is because art and design is the subject that makes thinking unusually visible. Within the process itself, you can often trace hesitation, revision, return, restructuring, refinement, and persistence. You can see students testing ideas, abandoning directions, revisiting processes, and gradually reshaping decisions over time. And I think that's incredibly important educationally, because those forms of cognition that often remain hidden in other subjects become materially visible within art and design. And for me, visible thinking depends heavily on curriculum clarity. And when students understand the structure and purpose of learning more clearly, they make stronger and more intentional decisions independently. So we're going back to that idea of independence. And those decisions then become visible through process, through refinement, and through sustained development. So increasingly, I think refinement is often misunderstood educationally. Frequently, I see it framed as improvement or correction or polishing. But actually, I think refinement is much more about sustained attention. It's about staying with an idea, a process, or a material long enough for thinking to deepen. And that's one of the reasons that I've become increasingly interested in the difference between refinement and redesign within curriculum development. Because refinement improves what already exists, but redesign changes the actual cognitive experience students are having with the curriculum itself. It changes how decisions develop, how ideas build, how independence emerges, and how students sustain inquiry over time. Because ultimately, structure creates the conditions in which thinking develops. And one of the misconceptions around a process-led curriculum, is that it somehow sits in opposition to rigor or strong assessment outcomes. But actually, I think that the opposite is true. Examination frameworks increasingly reward sustained inquiry, refinement, independence, conceptual development, and visible decision-making. So when curriculum architecture becomes stronger and more coherent, outcomes often become stronger as well. Not because the students are being directed more tightly, but because they're thinking more independently and sustaining ideas more effectively. And in many ways, the most successful outcomes often emerge from the strongest thinking structures underneath them. I also think that art and design can play a much more significant strategic role within schools than it sometimes does currently, because strong art departments model forms of learning that schools are increasingly trying to develop across the wider curriculum. So what I'm talking about here is things like reflection, iteration, problem solving, sustained inquiry, tolerance of uncertainty, of ambiguity, and increasingly independent direction. And art and design naturally creates a space where students learn to test ideas. We've spoken about earlier about navigating uncertainty, refining the decisions, and sustaining their thinking. And I think that matters enormously educationally, because art makes cognition visible in uniquely powerful ways.
And that doesn't happen at the end of the project, but every day, every moment of creation, which is really important.
Throughout, when they're making that thinking visible. And I think ultimately, the biggest mindset shift is moving from seeing the curriculum as a collection of projects, seeing it as the long-term design of thinking across the whole curriculum. Because when curriculum architecture, when it becomes coherent, students stop simply completing tasks and gradually become more capable of directing, sustaining, refining their ideas independently. And that's often the point where students begin thinking and working more like artists rather than simply learning how to behave like successful pupils within a system. So that they become artists, they start thinking and working like artists. So hopefully that gives you a sense of some of the ideas currently shaping my thinking around curriculum architecture and process-led pedagogy, and also visible thinking with art and design, much of which informs the curriculum development and consultancy and the CPD work that I do with schools and departments globally. So yeah,
thank you so much. We touched upon so many different, very important topics. And I have my little notebook and some notes for you, some questions for you as a follow-up of all that you said. So yeah, we can now stop the presentation and we can have a discussion on this.
I will stop sharing and there we go.
We just ended with this very interesting phrase that's there in my mind, and you were talking about thinking like artists.
Yes.
Can you delve a little bit more into it? Like, what is it to be an artist? My students often ask me that, when can we call ourselves an artist?
So I think it is about those layers of progression. And I think they're becoming artists. Well, they begin with being artists, don't they? I mean, one thing that I've always said is that often school art almost takes that natural artist away from you. Because they enter the world naturally as artists. They have that curiosity, that ability to play. But often as they move through schooling, they become more nervous of getting things wrong. They don't want to get things wrong. Where I was talking earlier about it becoming a performance. And particularly when they get into secondary years and are working towards exams, that they are working to exam structures, they're performing to exam structures. But I think if we, in secondary education, can start building that independence, can make them understand, can help them, not make them, help them, guide them into understanding that actually we learn from every little move we make on materials, from interacting with those materials. They're already starting to think like artists, aren't they? It's not something that happens overnight. It doesn't happen
exactly.
Once they finish their GCSEs, once they finish their IB, they don't suddenly become an artist. It's how we structure the curriculum and how we build the curriculum to help them, to nurture them, to become artists.
And that confidence, like you said, there's often that heavy criticism that they have, that judgmental thing. It's great to critique your own artwork, but not so much as to push their art to an eye that kills that inner freedom, the free play in it.
And that, I think, as well, is where my whole advocacy for starting projects by playing, as opposed to beginning with introducing students to artists, because if we do that, they're automatically thinking, well, I'm not as good as that artist. How am I going to be as good as that artist? Well, I might as well just give up now because I can't do that. So I think it is about encouraging that confidence through making and building that confidence and making art and the art classroom a place where they feel that they really belong.
And a safe space for them to explore, experiment, make mistakes. I also feel
where
that
they're not judged.
yeah, not challenged. And especially this anxious generation, as we call them.
Yeah.
And this idea of, whatever you're doing, it has to be Instagram ready by the end of the day. That I feel, especially in high school students, there's a lot of pressure on them.
I completely agree with that. And the culture that we're in now of immediacy, where everything is immediate, where you can watch a series, binge watch a series on television. You can order something online and it's with you within
20
a couple
minutes.
of hours.
Yeah.
So I think the students are so used to that culture of immediacy, aren't they? That actually having time and space to just explore and realize that these things do take time to evolve.
Yeah, that's true. And also I feel that deeper thinking maybe sometimes comes when we are bored, And
Absolutely.
now, so sad, our students are stripped away from that boredom. They're constantly being fed more information or something useful all the time, So
I think that's so true. And they often don't get that space to really notice and just to pay attention and to notice those little iterations, those little nuances that happen by just and we were talking about clay earlier, weren't we? By just making a mark in a piece of clay, or by ripping a piece of paper and twisting it. And it is that enabling them to have that time and space to just play.
Yeah. And I guess now, like, clay is not my primary medium. I'm an animation filmmaker and working with sand and these other material. But now, presently, I found magic in clay just because to address the same issue where the students are forced to wait, They create something and they have to wait for the clay to dry, to go to the kiln, be fired, and then see the result.
And then glaze it, and then go back.
Glaze it again, come back, and to see, and that feeling about, while glazing, you never know what magic is happening in the kiln.
Yeah.
When it comes back, the color is never the same. Nothing
Totally different.
Yeah. And you were talking about the students being stuck with that starting imagery, that my work has to reach there.
Yes.
So that often is not the case for clay because they can't control it.
That is very true because, as you say, you don't know what the outcome is going to be. And I think clay is a very good example, isn't it? Because they truly are forced to slow down and wait and to be patient and to know what patience is.
True.
Yes.
I can see my students are coming after 2 days and running in to just see what happened, So that is amazing to see, especially in these times.
Yes, it is.
So with that, coming back to the classroom, how would you shape, we were talking about artist research a couple of times, and we were talking about free play, exploration with materials. How do we connect these two things in real space in the classroom?
So how do we connect the play
with the artist research and then coming to and fro?
Yes. So During the project that I was talking about earlier, the To Play project, I'll give you an example here, where the students began by using verbs to create actions, to create actions on pieces of paper, and they were pieces of magazine paper, just to see what happened. And artists can then be introduced afterwards. So as students can start to see, okay, well, I could now start to extend this work by looking at whatever artist, let me think of one, Robert Morris, and how he used materials in quite an ephemeral way. So he looked at the ephemerality of materials and how materials change depending on where they're positioned, if they're hung, if they're placed on the floor. And this is just one example that I'm thinking of off the top of my head here. Looking at the Bauhaus and how paper was used in the Bauhaus. I'm trying to think of the artist. Oh, it slipped my mind now.
Sometimes we can see the artist's work, but the name is, yeah.
It'll come back to me later. But the artists are then introduced. So after the students have had a chance to play with paint, with paper, with ink, whatever, artists are then introduced to extend the thinking. Now, in higher year groups, that might be more independent artist research. In lower year groups, it might be artists introduced. Slightly more directed, maybe more directed in the very lower year groups, where they're getting a little bit more independence as time goes on to build that independence in.
And when you say directed, maybe we suggest 4 or 5 artists who's worked with similar material, and then they have the liberty to choose based on their, like the questions that they
yes. Yeah, and building the thinking, thinking, how has this artist thought about the work? So we need to build in questioning at that point as well, and encourage them to ask questions of the artist's work, as opposed to just trying to imitate the artist's work. But the curriculum architecture needs to scaffold that.
Yeah. Because often we see that criteria with an artist, when the artist is born, a little bit of bio, and all of that can be AI generated. Most of the time it is.
It can be AI generated. Sometimes it's not even particularly necessary. Sometimes it's necessary, depending on the nature of the work. The context is necessary. But often that's all you see.
Exactly, all you see. And then you stop there before you go deeper into...
And it doesn't deepen the thinking. So what we need to be thinking about is how that curriculum can be structured to help the students to deepen their thinking.
And maybe from there, they then later go into, where is the artist from? Let me look a little bit deeper into the context of the artist.
Yes,
then it opens up more doors of questioning.
Yes, and questioning differently as well.
Yeah. So now, again, in similar classroom setup, would you also encourage teachers to give more guided questioning to get them started? Or how do you take them to that level of independence?
I think,
and questioning?
So I think in the questioning, again, built into that curriculum architecture, built into that structure, it needs to be very well considered. But as I said earlier, it needs to be built across the whole curriculum. So looking at the whole curriculum and how that progresses over time, and how the questioning is built in, and how it's layered to develop thinking skills. But it is really important that it's not just that, okay, in the first year, in year 7, we're going to think of this, and then we're going to think of something else next year. It has to be layered, it has to be built, and it has to be progressive.
Yeah. So building that vertical articulation.
Yes.
Slowly, how we are kind of deepening the thinking.
Yes.
That way.
Over time.
Over time, over the years, with more practice.
Yeah.
And that leads us towards the end of one of these questions would be on the assessment. How would that look like in the classroom setup?
So when you say the assessment, are we talking about like the ongoing assessment?
Yes, the formative assessment.
So the formative assessment throughout. I mean, again, a lot of that comes from questioning, it comes from discussion, from dialogue, through, as the students get older, through one-to-one tutorials, and us using that kind of questioning to get more of an understanding of how their thinking is developing.
Yes.
Is that the kind of thing you meant by that question?
Yeah, like informative, it's more like, testing every day, every week, where do they stand? When rather than waiting for the end of the year or the end of the Unix summative. So
yes,
that very much is not structured, but yet it follows a path.
It does. It follows a path, but I think then is almost tailored to the individual student, isn't it?
Yes.
As more
especially for
rather than being, it has flexibility, so it kind of flows more naturally,
more organic,
and is led by, exactly, more organically, is led by the direction that the work is going.
And in that case, have you ever experimented with the students creating their own rubric, or the teachers, or it's more teacher-led?
So I'm a great fan of co-construction with students.
Same here, I love that.
I think, as soon as they have ownership over something, they become much more involved, rather than being something that can often seem quite abstract to students, can't it?
Completely.
It's something that has been created by somebody else. Once they start getting involved, and the co-creation of anything in the classroom, I think, is so important. The co-creation of thinking. I'm a great fan of dialogue amongst students, constant dialogue amongst students, because I think they learn as much from each other as they learn from the teacher. So I am definitely a very big fan of students being involved in the construction
of their own formative. So I've tried that during the formative, like, okay, for these 2 weeks, we will just look at this formative, but you design the rubric. What do you want me to see in your work and your progress? So that, of course, puts the entire ownership on them. And then, again, like you said, it's more independent, and they push themselves into that inquiry, into that questioning, and cross-checking with themselves whether that journey of 2 weeks has answered that.
Yeah, and it encourages their own reflection, doesn't it? It deepens their thinking, and it deepens their understanding. And I think especially if they're in dialogue with each other, so working in groups, to construct these rubrics, the questions, the assessment, it can be so powerful, can't it?
And it's amazing that when they, like you said, co-constructing amongst themselves, like, okay, this is what we are going to do these 2 weeks. So yes, that's I love that model, and I've used it many times in my classrooms. It
They
works much better.
become the teacher, don't they? I mean, there's that saying that if you want to learn something, you need to teach it, isn't there?
Yeah, true.
And
And getting
and I
in
feel
your classes.
that we can learn so much from the students by working in that
Every
way.
single day, yeah. It's more, easier to see it in the higher grades. But yes, of course, it could be started in a much, in a different context, maybe, in the lower grades, slowly giving them this ownership, more
I
guidance.
have
But you
I
have
have actually tried that. I've tried it with the lower groups, and wow,
really,
it
wow.
really, really surprised me. And I think if we build these habits early on,
Yeah.
that it becomes natural to them, doesn't it?
Yes, true. And especially with the new guide that we have in IB, which is encouraging this independent inquiry, learning, creating the rubric themselves, reflecting at every stages. So it's kind of easily lending itself to it then if we start much earlier on. Yeah. And now to wrap up that our lovely conversation we have, I want to, this last question about, you started with saying that curriculum is not neutral, right?
Yes.
If we can go a little bit deeper into that.
So where do I start with that one?
I know it's an umbrella for all the work you're doing.
Yeah, I could do a whole presentation
Only on that line. Okay.
the curriculum not being neutral, because I think as educators, where do I start with this? We need to be very careful what we bring to the curriculum, what we imagine the students already know.
Yes.
The places that they're coming from. This brings me back to the cultural capital, the idea of the cultural capital as well. Because everything that we do, that we say, has an impact. Everything we show the students has an impact on them. So that is where curriculum architecture, curriculum structure is so important. And it's why it's so important. We can all assume that students are going to come to the classroom with prior knowledge. I used an example a few weeks ago or a few months ago, actually, in a CPD that I presented to a school that I was working on with a school, where it might be what might be important to one person might be, I don't know, Shakespeare. What they might think is cultural capital might be Shakespeare. What might be important to somebody else might be what happened in a football match they were watching. So everybody comes with their own lived experience. I think that's what I'm trying to say.
Yes. That term is very important, the lived experience.
And the lived experience.
Yeah, when we come in, we come with the lived experience.
With our own lived experience.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the curriculum has to be structured to make sure that everybody feels that they belong in this space. And that everybody is given, that all students are given that opportunity to belong in this space. And that's where, again, it goes right in circles. It's where I come back to the artist references again, that perhaps starting with the idea of playing with materials, of experimenting, it widens the door for everybody. Instead of narrowing it, where only some people, again, back to the idea of belonging, it widens that door.
And also, I feel it encourages the students to have these opposite dialogues, right? By opposite, I mean very like if there's something at the center and we're all sitting around it, these are all different perspectives. So if
Yes,
you are seeing a cup from one end without the handle, because you are seeing in that perspective, does not mean that the cup does not have an handle.
exactly. That's
And that
such a good way of
dialogue.
putting it. A
Yeah.
lovely way of putting it.
Yeah.
Because, you know, and I think then they learn so much again from each other, because that dialogue they can have, and understanding each other and understanding the world as well from different perspectives is,
As a teacher, then it is the ownership to create that learning space, I guess.
through the curriculum structure and how it is designed to build that thinking over time.
It's so true. Yeah. Yes, this is something I'm going to go back with, and think more and maybe meet you again, because I could just continue this conversation with you.
Yeah, you've given me so much to think about as well. So thank you.
Yeah, this was amazing. Yes. I hope we meet soon on your
I
next
do
project.
as well. I do too. Yes. So thank you very much, and thank you for having me on your video. What do we call it? Video
The studio, yes.
visible
For
studio.
more conversations like this.
Yeah.
And I'm looking forward to practice a few things that you've shared in my own classroom, and looking forward to sharing that again, so that we can have that research-led data to keep improving learning from each other.
And I think that's so important, because, what perhaps the way I have approached something then kind of goes through this conversation, and then you will use it, and then it will come back again,
Back to
and
you,
we'll
yes.
see how through that kind of translation, the exciting things that happen. I often have people come back from, they might have been on one of my CPD courses and come back to me and say, oh, I tried this. And I look at it and I think, oh, they've done it so differently to how I would do this. But this is so exciting. And maybe I'll try this in the way that they have tried it. And that cycle keeps going. And it is so exciting.
And sometimes I feel that then the work becomes bigger than us, and that is where the true joy of an artist is.
It is.
So, yeah, thank you so much for this lovely conversation, for so many thoughts that I could go back with.
And thank you very much. It has been a pleasure.
Take care and
Thank
bye.
you.